Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I realise I'm the one thing between you and a drink and a snack, and for that I'd like to thank Air Marshal Leo Davies for his invitation to speak, but speak last. So I hope I can say some entertaining and useful things for you today. My topic is to ask if Australia is up to the challenge of overcoming our risky strategic outlook. We've had a day of challenges, and now it's fallen to me to attempt to answer the question, well, is our system going to make it possible for us to not simply survive, but thrive in this international environment? And my starting point here is to begin with possibly a slightly embarrassing story. Now this gentleman here is how many Australians really think of themselves in terms of our national qualities. Confident, extroverted, adaptive, good with animals. You think this is a risky strategic age? That's a risky strategic age, ladies and gentlemen. But let me tell you, our self-perceptions can be inaccurate. Crocodile Dundee was, for example, what many Americans thought all Australians were like in 1986 when the movie came out. And when at the age of 23 I went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston as a Fulbright fellow. They loved Crocodile Dundee, and they so badly wanted me to be Crocodile Dundee. Was I Crocodile Dundee, ladies and gentlemen? Well, this was me in 1989. That's what I look like. I can tell you I was quite a disappointment to my American hosts, although I do point out to you the rather fetching narrow green leather tie that I'm wearing. Sadly, I don't have that in my collection any longer. My point, and there is a point, Leo, is that we don't always live up to our national self-image. In fact, there's a long history of Australians doubting our ability to steer our own affairs. Some of you of a particular age might remember Donald Horne's book, which was published in 1964, The Lucky Country. And the real takeaway line from Horne's book was this one: Australia is a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. And his critique was really about a type of Australia that we all know, a complacent, short-sighted, very unstrategic Australia. And Horne's book was one of a regular series, almost one or two every decade, which argue exactly that point. But it can be countered by also more positive views about our capacity to deliver good strategic direction. And if you want an example of that, I'd refer you to this book by Ian McLean, written or published 5 or so years ago, Why Australia Prospered, which looks at the question of how it is that we've been able to run such a successful economy, not simply for a period of years, but really over the life of the country. Ian says Australians attained the highest incomes in the world in the middle of the 19th century. And remarkably, they have retained that pretty much right up until the present age, a standard of living that is not appreciably exceeded elsewhere. Few economies, he says, have been able to achieve that over such a long period of time. So the reality is that we have actually achieved quite a great deal in our short history. Is this good luck or good management? Well, a bit of both, according to Ian McLean. What I want to go to next is to talk about, well, what are the threats that we face that are impediments to our ability to thrive in this increasingly challenging international strategic environment. And I broadly identify 4 things about our national system, 4 things about the way we do politics that could be seen to be threats to Australia thriving. This is the first one, what I've called the Canberra Consensus. Now, I've been a resident of our national capital for 32 years. I love the place, but a strong case can be made that Canberra's isolation from the wider business community and from the mass of Australia's population has disconnected government from the realities of Australian life. It certainly is this. It's very much a one-company town, and of course that company is the Australian Public Service, which for a very long time was comprised of people who looked mostly like me, living and talking mostly with other officials, all with similar backgrounds and life experiences. So a clear risk to thriving is the blandness and the sameness of the policy advice that goes to government. And that, I think, is the second threat to thriving, is arguably Australians can be a complacent people. How complacent, I hear you ask? Well, the framers of the Constitution made voting compulsory in case we couldn't be bothered to go to election, to vote at election time. Our National Day is celebrated every year, but we're most enthusiastic about it when we can turn it into a long weekend. We're most passionate about celebrating our range of extensive military defeats. Now, for some years, the Lowy Institute, my competitors, you might say, at ASPI, have been tracking Australian opinion on a range of mostly international issues and also on Australian attitudes to democracy. And the results remain largely unchanged since the question was first asked in 2012. About 60% of Australians say democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. 60%. So 36% in fact say that either in some circumstances a non-democratic government might be preferable, or they say, for someone like me, it doesn't matter what kind of government we have. 36%. That figure actually goes up if you ask 18 to 29-year-olds. 48% do not agree that democracy is the most preferable system of government. So perhaps it's the case that long periods of economic growth have made us too relaxed and comfortable, and too unwilling to believe that we face a more risky future. The next threat is our political system. That's a polling place at Bondi, the last federal election. We're not badly governed, I have to say, but there are some out-of-date aspects to our political system that need fixing. So 3-year terms, a 36-month cycle for our federal government is simply too short for a strategically minded government. We have overworked and sleep-deprived politicians. Believe it or not, our federal electorates are 2 to 3 times the size in terms of the numbers of their electors than electorates in the UK and in Canada. We have about 100,000 voters per electorate in Australia compared to about 30,000 voters per electorate in the UK. So the result of that is exhausted members of Parliament unable to focus on national issues. Now, I have no expectation of ever being able to win this argument with anyone anywhere, but our system would actually be better if we had more members of Parliament with fewer electors per electorate. Our Senate voting system supports too many micro-parties getting into the Senate, creating a near-permanent block on government from the House of Representatives. So these are structural impediments to our political system which really do need to be changed if we're going to improve the quality of our strategic thinking. And the fourth impediment is just generally the absence of strategy. Mostly, government and the public service has stopped doing strategy, by which I mean long-term and complex planning. Defence is actually about the last place in town that tries to take strategy seriously. Instead, what we have mostly is policy designed around managing as much risk as possible out of the equation. Okay, so they're my four sort of horsemen of the policy apocalypse. And what I want to talk about now is, well, what are the things that we're doing well? If that depresses you unduly, I want to suggest 5 things of areas of public policy experience where I think Australian governments and their advisors in the public service and defence have done pretty well in recent years. The first one happened just last weekend, which was the holding of the first ASEAN summit in Sydney with the Australian government. It's actually no small thing to have 9 out of 10 of the ASEAN heads of government in Australia at the one time. Because here we have the leaders of 600 million people, effectively, that form our geographic front yard. Now, if Australia is going to play a role on regional security, a leadership role, this is the area in which we need to put some more priority. A second thing I think we've done pretty well over the years has been regional stabilisation. Operations like the one in Timor-Leste starting in '99 was really the beginning of the modern Australian Defence Force, and also of the way in which contemporary Australian governments think about how to use the military. So the role that we played then in designing, forming, and then leading a stabilisation force was new to a country which at that stage was more used to being a component of a bigger coalition operation. And what I'd have to say is there's no going back to that older style now. The region and our allies expect Australia to take a stronger steering role in regional security. I would say, though, that while we've been good at stabilisation, we've been poor at working out how to hand the reins of power back to the political masters of some of our neighbouring countries. And we've been even worse at promoting conflict prevention. A third success, Air Force modernisation. And no, Leo didn't ask me to put this slide into my presentation. It's not just because I'm talking to this audience. The Air Force is now effectively the go-to force that government thinks of first when it thinks about providing an Australian element to an international military operation. Air Force has the most developed modernisation program and has the most developed thinking about how to fight with these modern capabilities. So there's a golden moment, I think, a golden moment for Air Force to lead the ADF and defence thinking on the demands of joint and integrated fifth-generation forces. Now, I can't quite believe I'm going to say this to this audience, but Mark Ablong has left, so let's just keep it between us. We're pretty good at policy development, actually. Defence does a good job. If anything, it's a bit too ritualistic, and the organisation is way too disposed to worship at the altar of completed policy documents like defence white papers. But there's no doubt that these are useful bits of strategic policy thinking in an otherwise desert-like public service. The desperate need is to work out an acceptable way of quickly questioning and modernising policy when it needs it, instead of doing what we do, which is doggedly defending the out-of-date. And here's my fifth one that you may have spent a little bit of time looking at in recent months. The government, I think, deserves a real bravo Zulu for delivering such a comprehensive modernisation of Australia's legislation relating to espionage and foreign interference, which was introduced into the Parliament last year. When he did so, Malcolm Turnbull said that the laws had been based on the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation making significant investigative breakthroughs and delivering a series of very grave warnings to government about foreign interference. It's fair to say that our system has not, as a whole, had not grasped the nature and the magnitude of the threat. But I think the new legislation places Australia at the international forefront of attempts to counter foreign political interference. Okay, so these are some things that we've done well. And we've spent the day talking about the range of challenges that we face in international security, so I'm not going to, you'll be relieved to hear, go into the challenges in great detail, but let me highlight 4, which I think are unusually important from an Australian perspective. So some challenges that we have to deal with as we move into the future. First one is obviously China-US relations. This sets the broadest context for how Australia and other countries need to think about their strategic interests going forward. The key question for Australia is what, if anything, can we do to shape US and Chinese behaviour in ways that better suit our interests? And frankly, it's going to require a more activist approach to policy making than we're used to. The second thing has been referred to by a couple of my predecessors, and that's the speed of change that we have to deal with. I like to make the point that in the 24 months it took Australia to write its 2016 Defence White Paper, China effectively staged a military takeover of the South China Sea. We're simply not well geared to responding to the pace of strategic change that's needed to handle all the things rolling through the Asia-Pacific region. So look at our acquisition program, which is more focused on the Defence Force we'll have in the 2040s. I frankly doubt that the current international order will survive to that decade, not at least without there being a major challenge to the system happening much sooner. Next threat is hybrid threats, and the image there, if you're not familiar, is the Russian Buk anti-aircraft missile launcher moving into the eastern Ukraine in 2014, just before the shoot down of the Malaysian aircraft. The range of threats that we face are becoming more hybrid, and they're covering more grey areas short of outright conflict and impacting on the domestic spheres of our country. I fear that traditional defence thinking doesn't address the span of risks we face in this emerging environment. So I'd ask the question of all of you, can there be such a thing as hybrid warfare for good? Can we legally and ethically turn any of these strategies against our opponents? Or is hybrid a strategic approach that's only ever going to be something that's turned against us? And the fourth challenge is, of course, technological change. This is going to be the focus of much of the conference tomorrow, so I'm not going to dwell on it, save only to note that I think we're on the threshold of some astonishing changes to defence capabilities as a result of artificial intelligence. So the challenge for us is how do we gear our thinking quickly to these new technologies rather than continuing to polish the current and planned order of battle. Okay, so I've been through the challenges, I've been through the things that might slow us down, that make policy difficult to do because of the nature of our political systems. If we take the government at its word that it wants to take on a stronger leadership role in the region and internationally, I think it's worth focusing in on the costs of leadership, the demands of leadership, and whether or not, as a country, we're actually up to those demands. So 4 points to make about the demands of leadership. Great photo, if you look at that. All of most modern, all the recent prime ministers, with the exception of Whitlam. The first demand is that leadership costs. We've always wanted to have international leadership on the cheap. And I guess the important question to ask here is, can we really provide strategic leadership in the region while we're spending a fraction just under 2% of gross national product on defence? Frankly, I found it slightly embarrassing to hear Malcolm Turnbull in Washington, DC a couple of weeks ago celebrating as a demonstration of our ability to be a regional and global leader that Australia was nearing that 2% of spending on defence, when of course the United States in 2016 was spending 3.26% of gross national product on defence. My own view is that in time, strategic reality will turn that 2% figure into the floor rather than the ceiling of what our defence spending aspirations should be. And of course, if you look at that chart, you see how our defence spending has spiked, but usually only after a conflict has forced us into a more uncomfortable reality. The second demand of leadership is that it requires leaders to make decisions. And often governments are reluctant to make decisions because they close off options, and the consequences of decisions can be uncertain. Like, for example, our hesitancy to conduct meaningful freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. At the very least, I think we should publicly do one of those now. But frankly, the challenge is to be thinking beyond what is already a lost competition. So my question would be, what will we collectively do when China closes the airspace over the South China Sea for a military exercise? That's surely going to happen this year or next. That will be the moment when some new regional leadership is required. The next challenge of leadership is that it raises expectations. I've already made the point that we've become the victims of our own successes by conducting successful military operations over the last 15 or so to 20 years. So if anything, our allies and our friends have higher expectations of us than we have of ourselves. And finally, on leadership, individuals matter. Political leadership is a function of personality and capability. Some leaders have the ability to really lead, or they acquire that ability. Others don't. So in the words of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, what's to be done? What are the things we need to do if we're going to improve our chances of thriving in the challenging strategic environment that we all know is bearing down on all of us? I've got 6 suggestions that I want to leave with you as being things that I think, from a national perspective, are changes that we should make to how we make and do policy that would improve our ability to thrive in this new strategic environment. It may come as a surprise to you to know that, in fact, Cabinet doesn't tend to make many strategic decisions. Actually, what Cabinet meetings do is that they tend to be very transactional and make very week-by-week decisions, often in a quite reactive way. They're a sort of a clearinghouse of new policy ideas. The reality is that governments don't spend that much time thinking about strategy. But Cabinet needs to be our strategic engine room. During the middle part of his time as Prime Minister, John Howard actually held what he called special strategy Cabinet meetings twice a year. And they dealt with a 10 to 15-year outlook on the national economy and national security for the country. They were a great test of the long-term value of those day-by-day, week-by-week policy decisions. Now, I'm not aware of the Australian Cabinet holding a strategy meeting like that for the last 15 years. So more strategy for Cabinet. says the head of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Secondly, fewer political staffers. Now, I've been one of these people. I've spent about 7 years of my life over 3 separate jobs as a political staffer. So I have a sense of what these jobs demand and what's actually helpful to politicians. And I'm here to tell you we have a significant overcapacity in political staffers in Parliament House right at this moment, actually doing damage to how government does policy by applying a model of risk aversion to every decision that has to get made. Offices that were comprised of fewer but more experienced political advisors would enable ministers to develop better relations with their departments. Electoral reform. I think there's now a desperate need for Australia to move to fixed 4-year terms in order to give our governments the chance to be more strategic and to spend less time campaigning or recovering from political campaigns. I think we need to change the Senate voting system so that it returns fewer micro-party candidates who are just there to block policy and to rent seek, to sell their votes for preferential spending in their electorates. And as I've said, we need more members of Parliament, which I would trade off against fewer senators. This one might surprise you, university reform. What that list shows you is world rankings for Australia's universities in 2017. And frankly, I think it's something of a national indictment of our university system that the best we can deliver is the ANU at 20th in the world, and then a long tail of underperforming universities. Our universities are failing us. They've become degree factories, too obsessed with making money from foreign students, and they've lost sight of the core purposes of universities, which is to fearlessly pursue learning. It's time to review the purpose and funding base of our universities. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the long-term solution to the skills shortage that most employers, including the Australian Defence Force, worry about. Public service skills. We've de-skilled the public service to the point that many people no longer know how to do strategy or complicated policy. We need to promote people with the eye to encouraging imaginative leadership. Whereas right now, mostly the APS promotes on the basis of people's ability to manage problems away from senior leaders. You've all heard the phrase, safe pair of hands. That's what that means. It's about managing problems away, not thinking creatively and imaginatively. So the problem is that managing approach doesn't create any basis for making imaginative policy decisions. We need to promote policy competition. Now, my friend Michael Pizzullo and I don't agree on everything, I have to say, but he is a person who gets the value of competition for ideas within the policy context. That's why he engages with the think tank community. So competition, not consensus, is the thing that promotes better policy outcomes. There's got to be more active interaction with groups outside of the public service, not entities that are pursuing single issue sectional interests, but rather individuals and groups willing to push the policy boundaries. And my final recommendation is what I've called red teaming in defence. We need a questioning environment where people have permission to think unconventionally and to question policy settings. Now, I do see some of that happening in defence with the current focus on innovation. That's very welcome indeed. But I would like to challenge the Air Force to see how far they're prepared to go in taking this thinking. So, Leo, next time there's an air power conference, I encourage you to back the idea of an air power fringe festival. I think you should give your young officers, airmen and airwomen, the chance to think dramatically unconventional thoughts and then be prepared to fund the best ideas. So overall, these recommendations are designed to create a more stable political system, better able to make policy changes. Secondly, they're to improve the quality of skills that policymakers bring to their professions. And thirdly, to encourage more of that sense of challenge and contestability in policy development. This is the best foundation that I can think of to help Australia deal with the deeper and darker strategic challenges that we face. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my own presentation, and I think it's probably time for us all to go and have a drink and to talk further on these issues. Thank you.